Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll look into a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with the cultural political division in the country on display at yesterday's Super Bowl halftime, with Bad Bunny the main event, which most of the world saw in a joyous tribute to Puerto Rico and Latin American culture, all in Spanish at a time when simply speaking Spanish could get you deported. In contrast, there was the counter-programming by Turning Point USA featuring a washed-up right-wing MAGA relic, Kid Rock, which was about as big a hit as the Melania movie was. Joining us from Puerto Rico is Reece Martinez-Fernandez, a professor of history at the University of Central Florida. He is an historian of Latin America and the Caribbean who focuses on the histories of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic. He was born in Cuba, graduated from a Puerto Rican university, and currently lives and teaches in Orlando, Florida, which has one of the world's highest concentrations of Puerto Ricans. Then, since we all saw Border Patrol officers pepper spray and beat to the ground, then shoot an unarmed white American citizen 10 times in the back, we'll examine the history of the Border Patrol and speak with Reece, a Guggenheim Fellow and political geographer who studies the relationships between states, borders, and peoples on the move. He is a professor of geography and environment at the University of Hawaii and the author of several books, including White Borders, The History of Race and Immigration in the United States, from the Chinese Exclusion to the Border Wall, and most recently, Nobody is Protected, How the Border Patrol Became the Most Dangerous Police Force in the United States. He has an article at the New York Times we will discuss, The Border Patrol is the Problem. It Always Has Been. Then finally we'll speak with Stephen Walt, the Robert and Renee Belfer Professor of International Affairs at Harvard University. He's the author of a number of books, including The Origins of Alliances, Revolution and War, Taming American Power, The Global Response to U.S. Primacy, and most recently, The Hell of Good Intentions, America's Foreign Policy Elite and the Decline of U.S. Primacy. He has an article at Foreign Affairs we will discuss, The Predatory Hegemon, How Donald Trump Wields American Power. And before we begin at the start of this new year, which will culminate in the fateful midterm elections in November, polls already indicate MAGA Republicans will lose the House and possibly the Senate. But we're up against a Trump-Miller presidency already drunk with power, and they will do anything to stay in power, having already demonstrated their contempt for the United States Constitution with Trump's January 6, 2001 coup attempt. They see over half of the country as their enemy and have a private army of loyal thugs ready to round up critics of the regime they label as communist lunatics. As Trump cowers, the media and his cronies buy up the mainstream press, Background Briefing will continue to expose this malevolent regime's fascistic machinations, providing a daily insight into the news as a massive coalition of people power is mobilized to bring about an end to this nightmare and usher in a new era of reform not seen since Nixon departed the presidency in disgrace. To help save America's 250-year-old democracy, we need all hands on deck, and you can make a tax-deductible donation to help us do our part at backgroundbriefing.org/donate or at publictruthmedia.org. And thank you. And joining us now from Puerto Rico is Reece Martinez-Fernandez, who is a professor of history at the University of Central Florida. He is an historian of Latin America and the Caribbean who focuses on the histories of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic, and was born in Cuba, graduated from a Puerto Rican university, and currently lives and teaches in Orlando, Florida, which is one of the world's highest concentrations of Puerto Ricans. Welcome to Background Briefing, Reece Martinez-Fernandez.
Thank you, Ian. Pleased to be with you here.
Well, thanks for joining us. And you're in Puerto Rico, Reece, and I imagine there's a lot of celebration going on because their favorite son, Bad Bunny, performed last night in the halftime show at the Super Bowl, which has massive ratings. It's seen all around the world. It was an absolutely joyous event. I mean, I just loved it. And every word was in Spanish. And here we are in a country where speaking Spanish can get you deported I thought it was a very powerful political and cultural statement. What do you think?
Yes, it was. Here, it's everybody's talking about what transpired. Uh, Everybody's proud of having Bad Bunny reach those levels and make the statement that he was able to make. I'm here at a conference on Caribbean studies, and coincidentally, the first presentation by a major speaker was on music as resistance, dating back to the plantation days and salsa music, and everybody was making those connections. But in general, um, Bad Bunny has unified the Puerto Ricans, people who don't care that much about that type of music, myself included, but we've become fans, and he's standing for a united Puerto Rico.
Well, there's one person who's not a fan, and that is Donald Trump, the President of the United States, who said that he thought the halftime show with Bad Bunny was absolutely terrible. Quote, nobody understands a word this guy is saying. And he called the performance, quote, a slap in the face to our country.
Well, I'm glad he's not a music critic. There's something, before I was thinking about authoritarianism and the arts, and they've never gone well together. Arts are insurgent by nature, testing the boundaries, and right wing conservative regimes are not known for having produced a high quality art. Whether we go to Germany during the 1930s and early 40s, you look anywhere in the world, and the arts are fed by freedom. And that's what we witness with this halftime show.
Right. Hitler was not a great art critic, and nor was Stalin. But I thought, even though Bad Bunny didn't say F ice, which some people thought he might do, some of the imagery, I think, dealt with some of the local problems that you have there in Puerto Rico, where you are now, Luis. And that is, there was a sequence where they were climbing up telephone poles. And
yes,
isn't that pretty clearly a reference to the fact that the electricity that was destroyed by two hurricanes still has not been properly repaired because Puerto Rico is not treated fairly as, in effect, an American colony?
Yes, I saw that message, and I actually read it two different ways. The one you described about the current electricity crisis, which has been in place for several years under the management of a Canadian company, Luma, which is universally hated. But then on the other hand, I saw it as the promise of Puerto Rico. When you see those opening scenes with the cane fields, and then these Puerto Rican workers, electrifying the island. That's something that happened during the 1930s in Puerto Rico, and Puerto Ricans are very proud of their own leadership under Governor Luis Muñoz Marin, who spearheaded the modernization of the island, and electrification was certainly a symbol that represented that.
But isn't there, I remember the hideous scenes of Trump in his first term going down there after the devastating hurricane, tossing paper towels to people like he would toss food to caged animals.
Yes, that was so unfortunate and so shameful. It is, of course, symbolic. That episode was symbolic of a general contempt for Puerto Rico, its political leaders, its culture. And if there's, Puerto Rico is very divided politically. You know this well. When you have the status question that hasn't been fully resolved, so you have partisans of statehood to become a state of the United States. You have partisans of the Commonwealth with some enhancing, and you have partisans of independence. So they're very divided, yet it's become almost universal, a rejection of this kind of contempt and looking down at the people of Puerto Rico and their culture. So it has had a strong unifying effect.
Well, I think Bad Bunny's had a strong unifying effect on the American culture in general. And
Yes.
that's what's freaking out the Republican right and MAGA world. I mean, they put up their counter-programming through Turning Point USA, headlined by Kid Rock. And needs to say, I didn't watch it, and most people didn't. But reports indicate it was pretty pathetic.
Yes, I thought about watching it for this interview, but I thought I couldn't stomach it, really. It's very telling that in this country, in the United States, we're so divided that we have to have each. And of course, the vast majority watch the legitimate halftime show, but that we have two of them, and it's all politics. It is a reflection of where we are, and this didn't happen overnight. It's been happening uh, I mean, I would say since Obama became president, and the continuous um, insult of not just Puerto Rico and Latin America in general, but also Latinos in the United States. You see, Puerto Ricans, as you know, are U.S. citizens, but they're not. They're vulnerable to these raids, and they're all bagged in the same category. There were some scenes representing the diaspora, el barrio. There was some, barber shop and other businesses, which is also an interesting connection, which is so strong between the island and its diaspora. There are more Puerto Ricans living in the United States than living in Puerto Rico. That is very telling.
And you're in Orlando, Florida, which has the largest Puerto Rican population, Luis. But Puerto Ricans in the United States can vote, but they can't vote for president and Congress on the island itself. Is that right?
And that's very true. Uh, the curiosity is that Puerto Ricans do vote in the primaries, but they cannot vote for the president of the United States. They don't have real representation in Congress. They only have a resident commissioner who's not a voting member of Congress. They do have vote at the committee level. So it is one of those big contradictions that Puerto Ricans are called to serve in the military, but yet they cannot elect their president.
So there's often been said that the Democrats should try to get both Washington, D.C. to become a state and Puerto Rico to become a state, because that way they would pick up 4 extra senators. Because, as you know, the Electoral College and the red-blue divide is such in this country that rural red states have massive advantages and disproportionate influence and power, and that this would be one way to level the playing field, which would be to get 2 Democratic senators representing Washington, D.C., and 2 representing Puerto Rico. But would that automatically translate? In other words, and not that it's even going to happen, or at least happen soon, but if it were to happen, what kind of politicians would Puerto Rico produce? Would it be automatically a 2-seat pickup for the Democrats?
Yes, that's definitely true. Plus the members of Congress that we should add as well. Yeah, I don't see that being resolved anytime soon, the status. When we had the last states that were incorporated into the Union, it was Hawaii and Alaska. I believe it was 1959, 1958, 1959. And it was a deal because Alaska was Republican, Hawaii was Democrat. So they just invited the two and they canceled each other out. Under the current circumstances, we're the two Washington, D.C. becoming a state and Puerto Rico becoming a state, they would both be automatically and overwhelmingly Democratic.
So it's not going to happen soon, right? And we don't even know what's going to happen in November because Trump is determined to rig the vote, and he's making it clear. He's talking about nationalizing the vote with the SAVE Act, which is a way to disenfranchise Democrats. So this is a pretty pathetic and sad and very dangerous period for American democracy because you have an authoritarian trying to undermine it. He already did it once on January the 6th, where he organized a coup against the U.S. Constitution, and they stormed the Capitol. Those are the kind of people that he supports. Those are the kind of people who watch Kid Rock. But the majority of the Americans are not that horrible and ugly and hateful like MAGA is. So just in closing, I'm hopeful, and I thought last night's halftime show with Bad Bunny was absolutely needed and was really very touching, I thought.
Yes, I agree. And it was so festive. The feeling of happiness during the songs, during the dances, it was beautiful. Now, interestingly enough, Puerto Rico today has a governor who is a pro-Trump politician. That's an interesting development. She will be up for election in 3 years.
Mm. Well, I thank you for joining us, Luis Martinez-Fernandez. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And again, I've been speaking with Luis Martinez-Fernandez, who is a professor of history at the University of Central Florida. He's an historian of Latin America and the Caribbean who focuses on the histories of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic. He was born in Cuba, graduated from a Puerto Rican university, and currently lives and teaches in Orlando, Florida, which has one of the world's highest concentrations of Puerto Ricans. And he joined us from Puerto Rico. We're going to take a brief station break, and since we all saw Border Patrol officers pepper spray and beat to the ground, then shoot an unarmed white American citizen 10 times in the back, we'll examine the history of the Border Patrol.
Con mucho cariño para todos ustedes. Puerto Rico está bien cabrón, ey, está bien cabrón. De Carolina sale el reggaetón y los hijueputas de Bayamón, ey, ey. Quieren montarse en la ola y no han ido a Rincón. Un besito pa' abuela en el balcón, cogiendo todos los hoyos en la Rubicón. P-fucking R, ey. Tierra de Maelo y Teo Calderón. Y de Barea, el que fue campeón. Primero que Lebrón. Maldita sea, otro apagón. Vamos pa' los bleachers a prender un blon. Antes que a Pipo le dé un bofetón. Puerto Rico está bien cabrón, ey, está bien cabrón. Puerto Rico está bien cabrón, ey, ey. Pichea Maldiva, yo me quedo en Palomino, ey. Si no me voy pa' redes, un saludo a mis vecinos, ey. Aquí el calor es diferente. El sol es...
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Reece Jones, a Guggenheim Fellow and a political geographer who studies the relationship between states, borders, and people on the move. He is a professor at the University of Hawaii and the author of several books, including White Borders, the history of race and immigration in the United States, from Chinese exclusion to the border wall, and most recently, Nobody is Protected, how the Border Patrol became the most dangerous police force in the United States. And he has an article at the New York Times, The Border Patrol is the Problem. It always has been. Welcome to Background Briefing, Reece Jones.
Hey, Ian. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us. And we witnessed, thanks to brave citizens in Minneapolis who were taking videos on their phones, as they had done earlier with the murder by an ICE officer of Renee Good. In the case of Alex Predatory, we saw what happened, where he was jumped upon by about 5 Border Patrol officers. They pinned him to the ground. They put pepper spray in his face. They beat his head with a pepper spray canister. And one of the agents removed his gun, Predatory's gun, and said gun or something to that effect. Then the officer stepped back. The guy, Predatory, was prone on the ground, already beaten, and Border Patrol officers pumped 10 bullets into his back. So it's absolutely, unbelievably brutal. It goes against all police professionalism. But your book and your article in the New York Times indicate, Reece, this is just business as usual for the Border Patrol.
Yeah, that's right, Ian. The Border Patrol has a long history of being an extremely violent organization that has low levels of training for the officers. They're not used to interacting with the public in any sort of way. And they have questionable use of force guidelines that allow them to take a lot of instances that do not require force for most police, but to treat them as if they do require force for the Border Patrol agents. And we saw the results of that. So when we look at what's happening in Minneapolis, what we're seeing is what people in the borderlands have experienced for decades. The violence of the agency, the racial profiling, and also the exceptions that they have to a number of constitutional protections that protect citizens and immigrants alike throughout the rest of the country are waived, or there are exceptions to them in parts of the border zone. And so the result of that is an agency that's been out of control for decades, but now we're just seeing that in the bright lights of a large American city, but it's existed for a very long time.
So let's go back to 1924 when it was formed. It was formed in conjunction with an incredibly racist and xenophobic immigration regime that lasted for decades. And it basically meant that there were quotas, and the only people that could come to the United States without incredibly narrow restrictions came from Northern Europe. And it, as I mentioned, this regime lasted for the longest time. But now, when it was formed, there were only a few hundred agents restricted to within 100 miles of the border, or actually on the very border. One of the senators whose act establishing the Border Patrol in May of 1924 basically said that we are all on the alert against granting too much power to these officials to act without warrant. So even from its inception, there were questions about its use of force.
That's right. I think one thing a lot of people are often surprised about is that the United States did not have a border patrol for the first 150 years that it existed. So the border patrol was not established until 1924. And so then the question is, why did they establish it then? And it was to enforce the national origins quotas in the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act, which banned all Asian immigration and put very low quotas on everywhere, including Southern and Eastern Europe, except for Northern Europe. And so the headline of the New York Times when that law was passed was that America of the melting pot comes to an end, and that the racial type as it exists here today will be preserved. So it was an explicitly racist law, and the Border Patrol was created to enforce that law. But as you mentioned, David Reed, the senator who was one of the authors of it when they created the Border Patrol, was very clear that the Border Patrol was not meant to police inside the United States. Instead, he is very clear that they should be right at the border, and that's the only place where they have this authority to stop people without a warrant and interrogate them about their citizenship status. But what's happened is that has been expanded deeper and deeper inside the United States, and the agency has grown far larger than it was when it was first established.
But from the outset, these Border Patrol officers on the border were cowboys, and dangerous ones at that. As you point out in your article, the New York Times, Reece, one agent bragged in his memoir that he had killed 27 people, but that was just white people. He didn't bother to count black and brown people. Another agent, angered when a smuggler shot his partner, went to the Rio Grande and indiscriminately shot at every Mexican he could see on the other side of the river. So what we saw with Alex Preddy is something that's been going on forever, right?
Yeah, that's right. So the Border Patrol was founded, one, to enforce a racist law, but then two, out of frontier law enforcement. Ian, when you're working on a book, you always look for the story or the anecdote that kind of captures the idea that you're trying to show. And for me, it's the first Border Patrol agent. He's highlighted on the Border Patrol's website through the present day. His name was Jeff Milton. So Jeff Milton, before becoming a Border Patrol agent, was a sheriff's deputy in Tombstone, Arizona, just after the shootout at the OK Corral. He was a Texas Ranger. He also served as a mounted Chinese inspector who were there to enforce Chinese exclusion laws. And then he was hired as the first Border Patrol agent. So he's kind of grows up through this frontier law enforcement. But his name also captures the racist aspect of it because his full name is Jefferson Davis Milton. So the very first Border Patrol agent was named after the president of the Confederacy. So it kind of perfectly melds the frontier law enforcement ethos and the racism that infused the early Border Patrol.
And now there are 20,000 Border Patrol agents compared to some 1,500 in the 1970s?
That's right. 20,000 is the number last year. The big, beautiful bill proposes hiring 5,000 more. It's unclear how many of those they have actually hired. They have some trouble hiring Border Patrol agents. But yeah, at least 20,000, I think, is a safe estimate.
And according to the Southern Border Communities Coalition, there have been 364 fatal encounters with Customs and Border Protection agents since 2010. And Border Patrol agents have killed Mexican teenagers on the Mexican side of the border. And in April, the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights found that the U.S. government was responsible for torturing, killing, and covering up the death of Anastasia Hernandez Rojas while he was in Border Patrol custody. So this is an ongoing outrage.
That's right. And I think it highlights why now that we have all seen this visibly in Minneapolis, we've seen what happened to Alex Preddy. We see how these Border Patrol agents interact with American citizens and immigrants alike. The solution cannot be just to send them back to the border. That can't be the solution for two reasons. One is the border zone in the United States is currently defined as 100 miles from borders and coastlines. So that's a vast area where roughly 2/3 of the American population lives. Most major American cities are already in that border zone. So sending the Border Patrol back there does not solve the problem because it's still a vast area that they can do these things. But secondly, we've now seen how violent they are. So the solution needs to be something that reins in this agency in very significant ways that doesn't allow them to just go back to the status quo before they've been unleashed by the Trump administration, because that status quo was racial profiling, it was killings, it was violence, and it was violations of the Constitution.
But Reece, you mentioned the poor training. The two Border Patrol officers that shot Alex Preddy 10 times in the back while he was prone, lighted on the ground, having been piled on by 5 agents who beat the hell out of him. Those two guys turn out to have Hispanic surnames, which is a little troubling. I mean, it makes sense for the Border Patrol to hire people that speak Spanish, but what happens to when they hire people from the Latino community who end up killing people indiscriminately and rounding up Latinos?
Yeah, that's a complicated question that certainly applies to the Border Patrol. I believe roughly 50% of the Border Patrol workforce are Latino Americans. So it is a large portion of the population. And I think this is for a couple of reasons. One is, as you mentioned, the ability to speak Spanish is useful for Border Patrol agents. Two, in many of the southern border communities, Border Patrol jobs are among the highest paying job you can get with very low education standards. And so it's often, even if people maybe don't agree with the overall mission of it, they're often thinking of their families first and doing what they can to get a job that's stable, that has a federal pension, that pays more than any other job that they could get in those areas. And so I think those things drive the demographics of the Border Patrol.
Well, clearly, this is being operation is being run by Stephen Miller, who many suggest is almost a co-president. He has enormous influence in the Trump administration. Christy Nome seems to be sort of a, cosplaying Ice Princess decoration. Corey Lewandowski, her boyfriend, apparently runs the DHS, even though he's not an employee of the government. Their goal, I think, is to get at least 1 million people deported, almost entirely black and brown people. Of course, there's an historical precedent, isn't there? Operation Wetback, which ejected approximately 1 million people back in the mid-1950s.
Yeah, that's right. And I think you're right to focus on the racial aspects of the current administration. I mean, we saw this week as we're speaking, Donald Trump tweeted out a racist video depicting the former President Obama as an ape. I mean, the idea that this is not a white nationalist administration is hard to support. I mean, it's quite clear if you look at the history of Stephen Miller, he's had long links to hate groups, anti-immigrant hate groups, and he's taken that same ethos to his role in the administration. So it's clear that what they're doing is not about enforcing laws. It's about a racial purge in the United States. And I think it's for those reasons, though, that we shouldn't just though focus on this administration, because the Border Patrol has been engaging in these activities for many years in the borderland. So the solution to this problem is to, some people might use the phrase abolish the Border Patrol, abolish ICE. I don't really care what words you use, but we definitely cannot return to the former status quo of this agency. Instead, the future solution needs to look like something that completely tears this down. Maybe it rebuilds it from the foundation up, completely reimagines how this agency should work, because we cannot go, now that we've seen what they do, everyone now can see it. We can't just pretend sending it back to the border will solve that problem.
Well, just in closing, it's not just Latinos that are being rounded up. And by the way, Reece, I recently spoke with an immigration lawyer who's been visiting these horrible prisons that CoreCivic and Geo Group have, along with all the warehouses that they're buying. And I asked her, I said, is this a scam to soak the taxpayer for billions? Because every day that these people are kept in these horrible conditions with lousy food, etc., the taxpayer pays a daily, daily sort of rate per head, and they keep them there forever. And I didn't understand why you warehouse people if you're supposedly trying to deport people. And she said that's the whole point, that it is about cruelty. It's about making life so miserable for the people that they round up that they will waive their constitutional rights and basically accept being deported. So we have a government that appears to be engaged in a form of torture.
Yeah, the conditions in these detention facilities are horrific. And I think you're right to mention the profit part of it, that a large part of how the growth of border security and homeland security has been fueled by the corporations that are providing the gear, the facilities, and these private detention facilities, but also the food that goes into them, the clothing for the guards. I mean, there's a whole industry behind this. So when we talk about the $170 billion that was in the big beautiful bill, that was new spending on border immigration enforcement, that money is driven by that kind of homeland security industrial complex that's behind it. So there absolutely is a capitalist desire to have more people detained and to make money off of the suffering of these people.
But the suffering is designed to get them to waive their rights and accept deportation.
I mean, I think the suffering is meant to do a lot of things, but yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's part of
Right.
it, right? Is to discourage people from wanting to come, and then to make it miserable for people who are here, and also to, I think, make people afraid who are here, which people scholars have argued for many years that one of the functions of internal immigration policing is to create a vulnerable workforce that doesn't complain about working conditions, that's afraid to make a claim for workers' compensation, right? That's afraid to stand up for their rights. And then the result of that is this low wage labor force, the undocumented labor force that a lot of companies function on in the United States. So from that angle, it's not even meant to completely stop people from coming here. It's instead meant to make them vulnerable.
Well, Reece Jones, I thank you so much for your work, and I appreciate you joining us here today.
Thanks for having me on, Ian.
And again, I've been speaking with Reece Jones, who's a Guggenheim Fellow and a political geographer who studies the relationship between states, borders, and people on the move. He's a professor at the University of Hawaii and author of several books, including White Borders, The History of Race and Immigration in the United States from Chinese Exclusion to the Border Wall, and most recently, Nobody is Protected, How the Border Patrol Became the Most Dangerous Police Force in the United States. And he has an article in the New York Times, The Border Patrol is a Problem. The Border Patrol is the problem. It always has been. We're going to take a brief station break and back speaking with Stephen Walt about his article at Foreign Affairs, The Predatory Hegemon, How Trump Wields American Power. Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Stephen Walt, the Robert and Renee Belfer Professor of International Affairs at Harvard University. He's the author of a number of books, including The Origins of Alliances, Revolution and War, Taming American Power, The Global Response to U.S. Primacy, and most recently, The Hell of Good Intentions, America's Foreign Policy Elite and the Decline of U.S. Primacy. And he has an article at Foreign Affairs, The Predatory Hegemon, How Trump Wields American Power. Welcome to Background Briefing, Stephen Walt.
Nice to be back.
Well, thanks for joining us. And you conclude your article by saying predatory hegemony is a losing strategy, and the sooner the Trump administration abandons it, the better. But how much is it a strategy, and how much is it simply this one man? Because if, in many ways, history is determined by personalities. If Hitler wasn't who he was, maybe he wouldn't have had World War II, and if Kaiser Wilhelm wasn't who he was, we wouldn't have had World War I. So how much is this driven by this incredibly flawed person?
Well, I think there's no question that Trump is the driving force here, and one way you see that is that some of these instincts, this notion of trying to extract concessions from allies and adversaries alike, to sort of make everything a zero-sum competition and go after whatever short-term benefits you could reap. Some of those instincts were present in Trump's first term, but were largely controlled partly because he was inexperienced and partly because the so-called grown-ups in the room were constantly, trying to rein him in. Second term, none of those people are around. It's a series of loyalists and enablers and people who share that worldview with Trump. So I think you have to place much of the blame here on him. I just wanted to emphasize, though, all major powers act in a predatory fashion much of the time, but they usually do it primarily just towards their rivals, not towards their friends and partners and allies. And what's interesting about the Trump administration this time around is they're going after extracting as many benefits as possible from everybody in the hopes that they can just continue to reap benefits, always get the lion's share, even when dealing with longtime American friends.
But you make the case, though, that during the unipolar era following the end of the Cold War, that the groundwork in many ways was laid for this willful hegemon, that, quote, U.S. officials paid little attention to other states concerned, embarked on costly and misguided crusades in Afghanistan, Iraq, and several other countries, adopted confrontational policies that drove China and Russia together, and pushed to open global markets in ways that accelerated China's rise, increasing global financial instability, and eventually provoking a domestic backlash that helped propel Trump to the White House.
Yeah, I think there's 2 points to make here. First of all, I mean, much of the leverage the United States now has was really built up over the last 75 or 80 years, and a lot of it was then consolidated in the unipolar era. Particularly America's control over key nodes of the global financial system, for example, the dollar's position as reserve currency, the fact that you can cut other countries off from using dollars by essentially weaponizing the financial system. All of that was built up, and Trump and other American presidents have used it. But again, the difference is, I think, during the unipolar era, rightly or wrongly, American leaders thought what they were doing was good for America and good for the world. They actually thought, promoting close ties between the United States, Europe, our allies in Japan, gradually promoting a set of liberal ideas in various places was ultimately going to be beneficial. They were, I think, very naive about that, very naive about whether China was going to become a democracy and all that. But the intention wasn't primarily predatory. There are exceptions to that, certainly, but it wasn't primarily predatory. Whereas in Trump's case, there's no notion here of building a more constructive or positive world order. It's just trying to extract whatever concessions or short-term gains you can from any country that you're dealing with, whether it's a close ally like Canada or whether it's a hostile country like Iran. There's really no differentiation there.
So how much was the recent Davos meeting a watershed event? Because you had the Canadian Prime Minister Carney quoting Thucydides, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. And he basically told the world that the middle powers have to get together, and because if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And of course, we know that Trump appeared later, was furious with Carney, and made a devastatingly incoherent, rambling, almost insane speech that alarmed the world, and the dollar immediately tanked. So, I mean, it seems it's taken the Europeans a long time to figure out who this guy is. But have they figured it out, and are our allies simply alarmed that the leader of the free world is Donald Trump?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, they've, I think, now been on to him for a while, but there's been a question of what the best response was. And as I point out in the article, the initial response of many countries is to try and accommodate, to try and see if there's a way of either waiting him out or appeasing him or flattering him, something clearly that Trump and his administration tries to encourage, these shows of deference, these lavish displays of submission in some respects. But what Carney is basically saying is, that hasn't worked. Trying to accommodate him doesn't help. It's just a form of appeasement, and they'll come back and demand more later. And therefore, however reluctantly, medium powers have to start defending their own interests and cooperating more with each other. What made the speech so remarkable, it's really well worth anybody watching, is, first of all, Carney is not a radical. This is not Fidel Castro giving a harangue against the United States. It's a very calm, very measured, almost regretful speech that led to this. And what he's saying is, look, we're not doing this because we're angry at the United States. We're doing this because we simply have to protect ourselves in the face of a predator. And you're now seeing, whatever short-term concessions countries have made, they are now making long-term adjustments so that they are not as vulnerable to the United States. Canada diversifying its trade ties, Europe signing a trade deal with Mercosur, the Latin American Trade Pact, signing a new trade deal with India. These are all efforts to limit their exposure to American pressure, and it's a direct reaction to the hostility they perceive from the United States. And by the way, not just in economic matters.
So can you describe this in terms of soccer, since we got the World Cup coming up and they gave Trump a special prize? FIFA did, a very corrupt organization, needless to say, that everything Trump does is an own goal, because the greatest strength that the U.S. has had for the last 80 years has been the alliance system that is based upon the democratic countries standing together. And if you look what's happening in Ukraine, for example, the reason the Ukrainians are fighting to protect their country against a Russian invasion is that they experienced the kind of corrupt gangster government that Putin offers, and they don't want any more of it. And essentially, the other side, if you will, the axis of resistance, China and Russia and Iran, etc., they don't really have an alliance because they're a bunch of treacherous gangsters, So the fact that Trump is undoing this incredible strength that the alliances bring, it's what the military call force multipliers. It's just mind-boggling that it's happening before our eyes.
Yeah, it is really kind of extraordinary. I mean, when you think about it, the best neighbor any country could ask for is Canada. And that's been our neighbor to the north for, all of American history. Another great American ally, of course, has been Denmark, probably the most pro-American country in all of Europe. And of course, Trump takes aim at Denmark by claiming he wants to take over Greenland. Standing up to the United States is hard. There are short-term costs to doing so. There are big collective action problems because the United States is so big. You have to get a lot of other countries to work together to try and rein us in. So it takes a real act of diplomatic incompetence to start forcing other states to diversify away from the United States and to begin to try and coordinate their actions against us. As you say, it's been a great asset for the United States that most of the world's most consequential countries wanted to be on good terms with the United States, saw the United States as generally benevolent, not a threat to them. There were always disagreements on one thing or another, but they didn't see us as a direct and imminent threat. And Trump is, I think, now gradually changing that. I think the sooner we stop doing that, the sooner we'll revert to a condition where most of the world prefers to try and get along with the United States. And if we continue in the current path, then other states will, in fact, do less with us. Our influence in global organizations will drop precipitously. And perhaps most important, we start making countries that we regard as rivals look more attractive to others. When China comes forward and says, look, we're trying to be a constructive force here, we're trying to create a more stable world order, that may not be true, but it looks pretty believable to much of the world. And there's actually survey evidence from lots of countries around the world suggesting that China's image is improving over time and ours is falling precipitously. It doesn't mean the United States is about to get conquered, but it does mean that we're going to be somewhat poorer than we could be, somewhat less influential than we would be otherwise, and less safe.
Well, the genesis of, I think, the post-war world that led to this alliance system obviously goes back to the Marshall Plan, which is one of the most enlightened things that the U.S. ever did. Stalin was more afraid of the Marshall Plan than he was of U.S.'s nuclear monopoly at the time. And it's endured all of this time, and now it's being threatened by Donald Trump. And you write that we don't know whether our allies certainly don't know whether we would honor alliance commitments Trump has insisted that allies should pay for American protection and suggested the United States might leave NATO, refuse to help defend Taiwan, and abandon Ukraine completely. Apparently he's given Zelensky, said, until June to end this war, which the Russians clearly don't want to end. So, and you've got his successor looking at Trump's insecurities and infirmities. You can't discount the possibility of a J.D. Vance being president. He seems to be even more hostile. What explains that? We understand why Trump is who he is and why he's doing all this reckless and dangerous and self-destructive behavior. And there's a really interesting video out now from a caller, a Republican, lifelong Republican, calling into C-SPAN, basically outraged at what Trump just posted, a racist video of the Obamas looking like apes. And this man said, this is not a decent man. So just let's get over Trump. I hate talking about him. But what about his successor? What is that about? Why is he so full of hatred towards Europe?
Well, that I think reflects a certain set of cultural attitudes that are part of the MAGA movement, which has some roots in sort of white nationalism, in the sense that Europe is a Christian set of Christian societies, and that's what we all have to go back to. And I think J.D. Vance at least echoes some of that, may genuinely believe it. I do think there is a larger question here, sort of irrespective of who succeeds Trump down the road, which party they're from, that in 2020, when Biden came in, people could say that the Trump period was a odd little 4-year mistake the United States has made, but we'd learned from the experience we'd never do that again. And of course, in 2024, the American people proceeded to repeat that error. So it's, I think, going to be much harder, again, regardless of who the next president is, for people around the world to say, well, America will never go back in that direction. We did it twice. There's clearly something in the American body politic that is prone or fond or committed to a certain view of the world, a certain vision of the United States, and those people are not, 10% of the population. They probably 20 to 40% of the population. And that means other countries around the world are going to be harder to reassure that the United States is once again a reliable partner, once again a country that keeps its word, that doesn't constantly try and renegotiate every deal every time it looks like it needs adjustment, or anytime we get a little greedier. And so even a Democratic president who was trying to restore a lot of these ties and reassure the rest of the world is going to face an uphill challenge. The damage that's been done now will not be corrected overnight.
So how different is Trump's predatory hegemony from our colonial history, or at least the colonial history of the Belgians, the British, the French, the Portuguese, and the Spanish? And as you mentioned, also it influenced Nazi Germany, and the Soviets had an empire. They've been unbelievably clever, both the Russians and the Soviets, at pretending that they're anti-colonial when they had a massive colonial empire as well. So do you see some similarities with Trump? Not that, I hesitate to use the word strategy around him, because, again, I'm not sure there's any strategy here.
Well, I mean, again, I think he has a worldview, and the worldview, again, which the MAGA movement, I think, has embraced fully, is, the strong run the world, great powers manage everything. Stephen Miller has said this is iron law of politics, etc. You take advantage of the weak. They can't do very much, and you always want to be trying to get the most possible. And this, of course, was Trump's, business career, long record of cheating people he'd worked with, long record of fraud. You can do whatever you can get away with, and you're kind of either the sucker who gets taken advantage of, or you're the one who's imposing your will on others and getting everything from them. And that is his entire worldview. There's no sense of how I might actually be better off if I established a set of positive and cooperative relations with like-minded others where we share interests as well. He doesn't see the world that way at all. And again, there are enough Americans who I think share that view and think it will work. think that the United States is in such a privileged position, it can keep coercing, compelling, threatening, and basically extorting various concessions from others. And as I said, that sometimes works in the short term, but not in the long term. No one wants to be permanently vulnerable. And so any countries that can start minimizing their exposure to American pressure, well, will over time start to do that. That's again why I think this is an approach that contains the seeds of its own destruction.
Well, it's what's mine is mine and what's yours is negotiable. That's the way that Trump rolls here.
Exactly.
And you point out that hard power is still the primary currency in world politics. But we talked about soft power earlier, about the formation of the American Western alliances, NATO, the Marshall Plan, etc. Given that the greatest soft power tool the United States has, which Trump is undermining, is, of course, the primacy of the dollar. Will that be the first to go? Will that be the sort of, beginning of the end of U.S. hegemony?
No, I don't think so, in part because the dollar's not going to disappear as the primary reserve currency anytime soon. Its influence may go down. Other countries are starting actually to diversify away from complete reliance. The U.S. T-bills used to be the safe haven. That is less true than it used to be. So you're seeing some movement in that direction, but there's no other currency to replace the dollar's role right now. So I don't think that's going to happen. But I think your point that American soft power is being torched is exactly right. The soft power being the ability to get your way by attracting others, by persuading them, by having them want to be like you or emulate you or think you're doing the right thing, acting in a legitimate, sort of positive way. That's not the approach the administration is taking right now. And that makes others trust us less, fear us more, start to look for other ways of securing their interests, securing the things they need, rather than relying on a Washington that they might occasionally disagree with and that might occasionally make mistakes, but isn't, in fact, an actively malevolent force. And again, if you go back to the Mark Carney speech, what he was basically saying is that we can no longer see the United States as a strictly friendly power. We have to view it as a potentially hostile power and make the necessary adjustments to deal with that. And that's just remarkably short-sighted from an American point of view. You're better off in the world having lots of friends than having lots of enemies.
So just in closing, I just wanted to change a little bit from geopolitics to economics and reference an interesting article at the New York Times by Oren Cass. The finance industry is a grift. Let's start treating it that way. And essentially what he's saying, which is something I've been talking about for some time, Stephen, and that is that Wall Street is all about extracting wealth and not creating wealth. And if you go back to the 19th century robber barons, as bad as they were, at least they were creating wealth. And that this is unsustainable, the financialization of the United States economy. And the long-term prospect of American capitalism doesn't look good.
Yeah, I haven't seen the piece, so I can't really comment on it. I would point out that Cass has been a big supporter of Trump's economic agenda, which is ironic. I wouldn't have thought that a Trump supporter and you would be closely aligned on something like this, but I'll have to take a look at it and see what the argument actually is.
Right. But in general, though, do you think that that is, in other words, we talk about the end of American primacy. Will it happen via the fact that Wall Street is about extracting wealth and not creating wealth?
Well, I think, again, it's a little of both. Wall Street does both, right? The biggest problem is that Wall Street hasn't been held accountable for the various mistakes, self-dealing, acts of fraud, et cetera, that led to the financial crisis in 2007, 2008. Where it wasn't just that they made mistakes, they also were indulging, a lot of short-term profit-making while introducing lots of structural risk in financial markets. And ordinary Americans paid an enormous price for that, as did people around the world. But the people who pulled this off didn't lose their money in most cases and didn't ever face criminal action. And as I allude to in the article, that's one of the forces that spurred a lot of populism here in the United States, and that someone like Donald Trump, who of course is a member of that class too, but something he could use to ride his way to the White House in 2016.
Well, Stephen Walt, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Nice talking with you as always, Ian.
Well, thank you, Stephen. And again, I've been speaking with Stephen Walt, who is the Robert and Renee Belfer Professor of International Affairs at Harvard University. He's the author of a number of books, including The Origins of Alliances, Revolution and War, Taming American Power, The Global Response to U.S. Primacy, and most recently, The Hell of Good Intentions, America's Foreign Policy Elite and the Decline of U.S. Primacy. And he has an article at Foreign Affairs, The Predatory Hegemon, How Trump Wields American Power. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate and/or at publictruthmedia.org, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another Background Briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.
One more